You've heard of Airbnb, but did you know there are laws you should consider before you sign up to rent out your home? I'm Annie, and this is Law You Can Use. Welcome to the Ohio State Bar Association's Law You Can Use, where we answer commonly asked questions about different legal topics. Today, we're talking about rental homes, and I'm joined by attorney Bryan Hunt. He's an attorney with Loveland Law here in Columbus, and he deals with real estate matters. Thanks so much for joining me, Bryan.
Thank you for having me, Annie.
So let's start off by discussing how the government regulates real property.
So the state of Ohio and political subdivisions like cities, counties, townships, and villages get their authority to regulate property from the Ohio Constitution and certain enabling statutes. One of the most common ways that they do so is through zoning. And zoning is used to regulate both standards and use of real property. Standards are things like if you're going to build a house on the property, it has to sit 50 feet back from the street. Buildings in certain areas can't be taller than 35 feet, things like that. Use is exactly what it sounds like. You're allowed to have residential property in certain areas, commercial properties in others, manufacturing in others. So zoning is a big way in which property is regulated by the government, but there's also building and housing codes and just other standards that are found in the code.
Mm-hmm. So if I have to own a property in a subdivision or a condo community, am I subject to any Ohio laws?
Absolutely. So I would say the first level, if you think in terms of regulation being in layers, is of course the governing document itself, the declaration and bylaws. Those will contain the restrictions on the property if there are any, and most do. Those aren't laws in terms of Ohio. Those are self-regulating things that are adopted by the members of the condominium or subdivision. But then there are also statutes that apply strictly to those types of communities. Chapter 5311 of the Ohio Revised Code applies to condominiums. 5312 applies to planned communities. And those statutes mainly apply to the formation of those and what needs to be included in the declarations and bylaws. But importantly, those do allow for associations or owners who are aggrieved by how somebody is using property to file a lawsuit against that person and seek damages, injunctions, and importantly, attorney's fees as well.
Mm-hmm. So if I own a property and I decide to use a service like, for instance, Airbnb and rent out my home, and it turns out I've violated a zoning ordinance or a community governing document, what happens then?
So it depends. If it's a law, like a zoning ordinance or some other requirement that's required by statute or ordinance, chances are the homeowner will get some sort of violation or notice of violation. These things are going to be very regional, and different communities will handle things a different way. There could be a small fine or penalty that has to be paid. If you don't come into compliance or you don't correct the problem, the penalties, of course, could escalate, get pretty serious. In a subdivision or condominium, practically speaking, most of the time the board or other residents will communicate to you the problem first and ask that you stop. And if you continue, then there are certain consequences with that as well, and that depends on the governing documents. They often will spell out what kind of action the board could take in addition to all the legal remedies available under Ohio law.
Mm-hmm. And aside from these laws that we've discussed, if I'm a property owner, are there other laws that I should be aware of before I rent out my home?
Yes, so liability is a big issue. I think these services are kind of in a limbo right now, and people are trying to figure out how they should be regulated. But if somebody gets harmed while they're renting out your property or burns your house down while they're baking a pie or something like that, there's a question on whether insurance will cover it or if you're going to be liable. I would say that most traditional policies, homeowners insurance and liability insurance, might have a blind spot for these kind of services. So it's important to make sure that you're properly insured and covered in that way. And I think some of these services like Airbnb may even offer their own type of insurance. There's also a potential for venturing into a landlord-tenant relationship. And an issue becomes, what if somebody begins to occupy your property and then refuses to leave? Do you have to go through the eviction process, or how do you get that person out? And then finally, there are federal laws that are important, the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and things that might apply. But again, courts and agencies are kind of in the process of trying to figure out how these should be regulated.
Mm-hmm. So how can an attorney come in handy if I'm thinking about renting out my property?
So on the front end, they could be handy in terms of helping you navigate the local requirements, putting you in contact with people in the zoning department or people at the auditor's office and making sure that you're talking to the correct people, helping to understand zoning laws. Each city and county might have their own standards and they can get complex occasionally. So an attorney can help you understand whether or not you're allowed to engage in that kind of activity. If you're in a condominium or subdivision, he or she can help you understand the declarations of bylaws. Those documents can be amended so they can make sure that you are seeing the entire picture and not looking at something that's outdated or has been changed. If you've received some sort of notice from the city or county or from your association, an attorney can help you respond to that as well and make sure that you're being afforded proper notice, due process, and if it's a declaration of bylaw, that it's being interpreted correctly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much for joining me to answer them.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
If you have a topic that you would like to learn more about, follow the Ohio State Bar Association on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and write to us using the hashtag #LawYouCanUse. And to learn more about rental homes and more than 600 other legal topics, go to ohiobar.org/lawYouCanUse, and thanks for joining us.